Greetings from COP26. Thank you everyone for joining us. Today, we're going to talk about NDCs, which all this COP is about, what nations are going to do, but how do we actually convert them to local action and why cities are important. One thing we have learned, you just saw the video, most people in the world today live in cities. Most of the carbon emissions in the world come from cities. Most of the economic productivity, 70–80% of it depends on the country, come from cities. So the question is, you can't actually get to 1.5 degrees without cities being better. So we're going to talk about today, how do we get there? How do we finance it? And how national government and cities have to work together. Before I do that, I have a fantastic panel for you. But the question is, why should we care? The cities are actually an incredible opportunity. If we get cities right, this unleash an enormous amount of wealth that is locked in cities. Not only that, we can get to a world where it's greener, it's better for our citizens because most people live there, but it also produces jobs that you all need for the recovery from the COVID that you just saw in the video. So the question is, again, how do we get there? And what is the collaboration we need with national government and cities? This is an event that's co-organized by GIZ, by Coalition for Urban Transition, and C40, and the Coalition for Urban Transition produced two very important reports on climate and cities and what role it plays in national economies. A lot of the discussion is based on that. Before I go to that, I want to introduce my first guest. Ingrid Hoven heads a group of people that runs GIZ, one of the biggest organizations that helps technical assistance across the world. So Ingrid, in this idea of national government and cities, to do all the things we want it to do to be successful, it needs financing. How do we get to a model that cities actually get the kind of financing that it needs to be successful?
So thank you, Annie. It's really a pleasure to be with you all here in Glasgow. And perhaps I would like to start to say a little bit about the very difficult framework conditions we are operating in. Financing NDCs at the local level has already been quite a challenge in the past. But when we look now what actually COVID-19 how the impact has been on cities, on economies, on communities, we have to take into consideration that we have to deal with this wide range of challenges at the same time. And this is now an additional challenge. So the economic challenges, you mentioned it, Annie, unemployment has soared, and up to 150 million people are expected to fall into extreme poverty, again, due to the pandemic. We have social challenges. The urban poor are living in overcrowded conditions and without access to adequate services, social safety nets, or transport. And they are especially vulnerable and have become even more vulnerable throughout the pandemic. And then finally, climate change, of course, has put another risk layer on what is happening in cities and are exposing cities and communities to heat waves, floods, landslides, and of course climate hazards have actually escalated rapidly. So when you then look at the financial situation cities and communities are right in now, they have lost income. Utilities have lost income. They have lost taxes. And now actually we expect them to contribute to deal with the climate challenge. And they are so important and as has been said in the video that we have just watched. And I think we have really to be now serious about bringing the finance to communities and cities, and at the same time provide the type of technical capacity, knowledge, and analytics that they need to do the right things with the money that then could become available. I would like to mention three specific cooperation models that we have developed over the last couple of years, I have to say. We started 2 years ago, that would bring actually additional hope and additional support to cities. The first one example is the so-called City Climate Finance Gap Fund that helps prepare urban climate projects at a very early stage. It's called gap fund because an analysis actually identified that there is a missing link. So normally cities have brilliant ideas. They worked on them in a very inclusive manner, and then they have a first concept. But this concept is never been picked up by a bank or a multilateral or bilateral donor. So there is a gap. In order to make those brilliant ideas ripe for financing, we developed this city climate finance gap, which actually provides concrete technical support to cities and communities to develop those ideas into concepts that then can be picked up by bilateral or multilateral donors. And we are doing this together with the World Bank, with the European Investment Bank. GIZ is a partner. And this fund is being financed by the German government and Luxembourg. And so far, we have created a really actually an exciting demand. Already 140 expressions of interest have been received by the GAP Fund. And for 33 cities, we have approved actually concrete technical support, mainly in India, Mexico, Ethiopia, Morocco, Ecuador, or Brazil. The second partnership that I would like to bring in when it comes to financing is the so-called NDC Partnership. Why would I like to underline the NDC Partnership? Because it's very unique, actually, in bringing financial cooperation together with technical assistance. And the NDC Partnership tries to build up a very comprehensive and coordinated approach at the country level. So they would like to have partner countries, developing countries, in really to making clear what kind of investment do I need, what are my priority areas for action, which actually euro would actually would actually contribute the most to climate protection and adaptation to climate change. And we have identified that actually many NDCs have incorporated the needs of communities and cities. So the NDC Partnership, for me, is a vehicle where we can actually work together, join forces, and bring the right mix of technical support and financial support to developing countries. And last but not least, I would like to highlight a work that we have actually developed in Costa Rica. Normally, the challenge is when you go to developing countries, they have aggregate climate ambition targets. But in order to make this operational, you need to break it down into sectoral budgets so that you know exactly which sector has to contribute how much to your climate target. And this is easier said than done, as we know this quite well from Germany as well. Exactly this was the plan when we worked together with the Costa Rican government to say, look, why don't we look much deeper into the NDCs, break this down into investment plans for specific sectors, bring in actually communities and cities, and make sure that when we develop now a climate-friendly energy sector, transport sector, and agricultural sector, that then actually the needs of communities and cities are brought on board. So the work on sectoral targets and on investment plans that actually are underpinning the financial needs in specific sectors is also, I think, an avenue to bring in help for communities in city more forcefully, because the whole plans actually give a better direction and actually also price tag. What is needed? What does it take to achieve a specific sectoral target in this specific country? Thank you.
The NDC Partnership is a unique partnership that Ingrid just mentioned. It brings multiple countries together and that form a team that provides technical assistance to countries to make the NDCs better. And that promotes, as Ingrid was talking about, an integrated approach towards climate planning. That is what NDCs are. And this COP, the discussion is not just about climate. It's how to make the outcome better for climate, of course, reduce carbon, but better for people and better for nature. So these are the three integrated outcomes that we need. And actually cities are a very good place. And you'll hear from a mayor in a minute where it's a very good place to achieve it. And 1,000 cities have actually signed up for a race to zero. So cities are doing their bit. But cities really cannot do it on their own. Cities and national governments have to work together. But I want to bring in Carol here. Carol Saab, you are the CEO of the Federation of Municipality. And I wanted, Ingrid was talking about how to get support to cities and cities can play it. I want you to just jump down to a very specific mechanism that you have in Canada that you're encouraging. One of the things our report, our analysis shows, building retrofit or making buildings efficient is by far the best dollar you can spend on mitigation. So if you had $1 to spend and you wanted the most outcome, you want to make a building more energy efficient because buildings live for a long time. You have developed a very innovative mechanism to support getting this done in Canada. Tell us more about it.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Annie. And I'll just say as well, it's a pleasure to be here with you and with the esteemed panelists as well. And thank you for the question. I'm excited to have the opportunity to elaborate on what we think is really an innovative Canadian case study. And I'll get to the specific initiative you asked about in a moment, but I'll contextualize it in our larger initiative, which is called the Green Municipal Fund. It's a $1 billion endowment fund. It's funded in its entirety by our federal government, but implemented through the organization I head up, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, which is our umbrella organization for all local governments in Canada. And what we do with this fund is basically we use the dividends of the endowment fund to disperse grants and low-interest loans to municipalities across the country, to local governments, to really catalyze innovative sustainability practices and seed that, create something that they can then scale and crowd in other funding around. And so we've been operating that for 20 years now. We just celebrated our 20th anniversary. I will say, though, we took a substantive uptick in 2019, which is when the government put in close to $1 billion of the what is now a $1.6 billion fund. And since then, we've been able to launch a number of new initiatives. And one of them is the one you're asking about, specifically around retrofits, which is called the Community Efficiency Financing Initiative. And we actually, have stolen some ideas, borrowed some good ideas from our neighbors in the U.S. around PACE programs, property assessed clean energy. And so our fund around the community efficiency financing is about $300 million. And what we do is basically give municipalities the funding to be able to operate financing programs for residents to pay back over their property tax to retrofit their buildings. And so it is having a significant impact of the country, across the country. This is, we borrowed the model. It's widely used and it's quite successful in the U.S. context, largely in California as well. And in the Canadian context, in just 1 year, to your point about cities really stepping up and being ready if they're given the tools, we've gone from, about 4, maybe generously 5 versions of PACE programs in the country to close to 30. And that's in 1 year of operations of this new initiative through our Green Municipal Fund. And so it's a really great example of what is possible when you connect the national government tools and their dollars and funding with a mechanism that is working directly with cities and able to do it. And what is unique about our Green Municipal Fund, it's the same with the Community Efficiency Financing Initiative as it is with the other streams that we run, is that we pair that also with knowledge mobilization and capacity building. And so it's not only the financing, it brings in these other elements as well. So we really are creating sort of the best practice community around all of this, as well as providing the funding. And, in the Canadian context, that money, it doesn't, $300 million, you can imagine how far that goes. But what I think is unique and perhaps an interesting part of the model to explore is that we're really focused on this sort of incenting and catalyzing innovation. And so we're picking projects that are really sort of early on the scale of being adopted across the country, so that then we're sort of front edge funding those kinds of initiatives so that then they can be scaled where they're successful. And then ideally municipalities can then crowd in other funding and continue to grow from there. And so I truly think that it's one of, obviously I'm biased, I think it's a great, great model, truly sort of a Canadian case study, but it's where we figured it out with our federal government, at least in this space, how to do it, and it's a model that's scalable. And so now the conversation continues. We currently work across 5 sectors, and there's certainly room to grow that, and even within the sectors that we work in where we're experiencing great success, what more we can do with our government.
I think it's actually, Carol, it's a fantastic model where there's a real national government, local government collaboration, and the fact that it's being done through the association, that there's a feedback loop of what's working, what's not. As you said, you have the fourth version of it. It's such a good example of what could be done, and I'm sure with this success of this, you'll have other programs like that to encourage cities to do other things. I mean, there's been dramatic results in this. New York City has dramatic results in this.
Indeed.
In the carbon management. So it is a successful model which I hope other cities, other countries actually, can adopt to. And it's one of the things that are relatively easy to do. You don't have to, it's not a rocket science.
That's correct.
To do building retrofits. So thank you for leading that. I'll come back to you. I want to go to Mexico now, to our mayor of Monterrey, who's right here. But before I do that, he has brought with him a very impactful video that we'd like to share.
Hello, my name is Eugenio and I live and breathe in Monterrey. My hometown is the capital of an industrial state located in the northeastern region of Mexico that shares a border with the United States. In Monterrey, just like the rest of the living world, we're living in a climate emergency that could bring irreversible consequences if it's not dealt with quickly. Monterrey and its metropolitan area have had a messy and fast-paced urban expansion. You see, more and more houses being built, far away from everything. Some of them are even in the mountains, where basic public services are hard to install or get. On top of this, we had an insecure and inefficient public transportation system. Mobility is focused on cars and urban infrastructure. My mom has a car, my dad has a car, my older brother has one too, my grandma has a car, and all my 4 uncles and aunts have cars too, I think. In a city, for every person that has a job, there's at least one personal car driving through our streets. Can you imagine the time it takes us to go from our house to school? Never mind the pollution that makes. The transportation industry and many others like it, like the refinery in Cadereyta, have increased air pollution, making us the most polluted city in Latin America. In 2019, when I was 8 years old, more than 60% of the days in the year had bad air quality. I think that in not too far away future, my friends and I simply won't be able to go play in the park because breathing that air is hurting our lungs. To make things worse, Monterrey creates a lot of garbage and only 1% or less is recycled. Approximately 1.20 kilos or 2.64 pounds of waste are produced per person in the city, and around 20% of the city's waste, generated by us, are not recollected but thrown to the streets and other unsuitable places. This has to stop. The apocalyptic future that was forecasted here about 6 years ago has come. We have no more time left and we must act right now. My name is Eugenio and I breathe in Monterrey.
Too many cars in our cities. So here is Luis Colosio, Mayor of Monterrey. Luis.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Monterrey City is a very important city in Mexico.
It's the second largest metropolitan area in the country.
A lot of things to make the city better from the climate perspective. Tell us a few of them.
The urban design of Monterrey over the years was always centered around the vehicle, never around the person. And that obviously complicates things enormously because the distances to travel, the mobility that we offer to people is very, very short-sighted and very, very hindered. So the crisis, I mean, you saw the video, you saw the miasma of pollution that we breathe every day. And it's, you know, Eugenio wasn't exaggerating. There are days that the air quality is so bad that the government doesn't let children go out to play at recess. And that they recommend people not to do outdoor activities. That is absurd. So we really need to stop thinking the way we've always thought, because I mean, I celebrate that on the federal level, all nations, you know, they have this program to affect climate action, and various state governments also do the thing. But you said it, and you pointed out very succinctly at the beginning. Cities have to take a more serious role, because cities create around 70% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the world. We need to take things seriously. And I mean, in Mexico, we have a lot of limitations. I mean, constitutionally, we have very low attributions that we can actually effect to stop climate change. I mean, we can do a lot of things, but we also need the resources to do it. And that's where, that's where things go sideways. Because normally, I mean, as a region and as a country, and I have to be very self-conscious and I have to be very honest about this, we lack the political maturity many times to do these things with our peers. Because sometimes when people are not part of the same side of the political spectrum, well, they tend to hinder one another, and then, they tend to not be very collaborative. And that is very unfortunate because, I mean, for example, and you actually, you mentioned the gap fund earlier. I think that's a wonderful idea and a wonderful initiative because in many cases, when a city asks for international funding to affect one of these projects, I can talk about the project I want to implement in the city, but when we ask for funding, what's the first thing any financial institution asks of you? A warranty. And in case of a city, you need a federal warranty, a sovereign warranty. And more often than not, the federation will not give it to you if you're not aligned politically with them. Or if you do not share the same agenda. I mean, federally, right now, we're going very different ways. I mean, we have a federal regression on the political climate agenda, and the energetic policy is just off, it's brutal. It's brutal. So we need to, think outside of the box and find these sorts of initiatives and these collaboration schemes that allow cities to take the serious role that we need to take. I mean, Monterrey, yesterday, declared a climate emergency. We are the first city to do so in our country. We are very late as a country to join these sorts of efforts. And we are now, as a city, joining more than 2,000 cities that have done so all over the world. We are taking this thing seriously. And this means that the public policy on climate change must be transversally present in every single institution and every single public policy that we implement.
I'm a little intrigued. You are an elected mayor of a very important city, and you just said that the politics is not mature. Can you say a word more about that?
There's a lot of immaturity in the political arena because there's a lot of egos and there's a lot of
among cities or with national governments?
I think it's national. It's nationwide. I mean, there's a lot of ego in the public system. I mean, I think that's present pretty much everywhere. But, oh boy, we give everybody a run for their money. and we must be humble about those things because I understand that there will always be political differences and there will always be different elements in the agenda, in the public agenda. But there are certain things that must not, by any means, be, dragged into a political struggle. And an effective climate public policy is one of those things. But because we want to live in a future where the planet still exists. Otherwise,
absolutely.
We're not going to live.
Thank you, Luis. The reason I asked this question to Luis is that it is impossible to get to where we need to get to 1.5 degrees if we don't get our different levels of government working together. National government, regional government, and cities government together to the goal of reducing what we do. So for example, here at Glasgow, we're talking about NDCs, every country's contribution for reduction of carbon. What does it actually mean? You saw the young man there. It actually means for you and I to actually not take our cars, to take public transport. There's 1 billion cars in the world today, 1 billion, write it down if you do not know this. And if you don't do anything about it, there'll be 3 billion cars. There's no way to get 1.5 degrees with 3 billion cars in the world, even if all those cars were electric, just to be clear. So I want to go to take Luis's question to Adriana Lobo next. Adriana Lobo leads WRI Mexico and has been leading WRI Mexico for a long time and is very familiar with the question Luis was talking about local government, national government. And Adri, in Mexico and in Colombia, two countries you work very closely in, these national level strategies, NDCs, for example, both the governments are here, we are speaking to them. How do they get translated to local action, or how can they get translated to local action?
Well, we have seen that local action is first super important because this is where the NDCs get implemented. It's always, or in many cases, territorial, right? Either you use the car or you don't use the car. Either the roads are ready for cars or they are ready for people. And however, how the electricity gets into car and how the builds are done and what's the construction rule. So there is a very big space for cities and a very big role for cities. But one of the things that's usually missing is really finance. Cities, at least in Mexico, but also in Colombia, in Mexico harder, they get very little money for themselves. They really depend on the national government. So once you depend on money from the federal government, if there is no alignment, it's very hard to do big things. Cities can do small things alone. They can advance a lot, but the coordination with the national government is absolutely essential. So when we try to do things, first we need an alignment. You need some sort of common objective. And that's why national programs really help. And I would like to give an example. We had for a long time very small development of sustainable transport. But then, let's say 2 ways in Colombia, they started to make a very legal thing. They had a very legal agreement in the country, and a lot of national government money in this case, with a certain rule. And then it starts to develop it in many cities. In Mexico, we had one example in Mexico City of one bus system, and then cities could not advance. And once we got to the national program, which actually we developed a lot of the rules with the World Bank, and the collaboration there is very important. Then we started to have 1, 2, 3, and then we have a pipeline of 40 projects and 10 already implemented in few years. So this alignment of vision on where we want to go, what are the things that we need to do to get where we want to go, and how we finance them with a collaboration or with a complementarity of money is very important. We can always help with technical assistance, but the big investment really need different kind of funds, and it needs to habilitate the cities to be a lot more mature in many ways. We need to find ways that the money gets to cities, and we need cities that starts to develop the financial capacity to be able to jump into these opportunities. We were just talking to a friend yesterday, and she was trying to develop a facility for cities, and only 3 have good debt qualification. So it's very hard. Cities are not prepared to be receiving the financial resources themselves today. So there is a very long way for us to prepare cities to have more financial resources by themselves in Latin America, and to have financial strength, to prepare their projects, but also to be able to get the money by themselves. And I think if we can go this way, the kind of action we can see in the future is much faster, is much more effective, and being more independent, I think also more collaboration and complementarity will come.
But Audrey, this point you made, I think in Mexico, this program to support public transport in cities was a long-running program, and that has a dramatic impact. One is what running, and this national government investing in public transport, which is a very big climate outcome, like one of the more significant climate outcome. We would like to see these programs or these investments much more central in the NDCs, which we, as you saw, we analyzed all the NDCs, and we didn't see that. But Carol, I want to go to you because Canada is one country where the national government actually has active program on different kind of local government investment, like public transport that Adriana was talking about. And you've been working with them. If you can, because it's a good story, so we don't want to just talk about what is not working, because we need to learn from what is working, right? And in Canada, it's actually, my understanding, it's a positive relation with cities and national government, and a proactive national government and cities. Tell us of the relationship, and why is it working?
Great. Okay. Well, thank you for the question, and you're right in your understanding of the situation right now. It hasn't always been the case, but it's been increasingly a productive and very positive relationship between our national government and local governments and cities and communities. Again, I'll contextualize this a little bit, and I'll give you three very specific examples of sort of how that relationship lives tangibly. But I'll contextualize it just for sake of awareness here. So we're on our 6th year now of a 10-year, $180 billion infrastructure program.
Repeat the number again?
Yes, it's a 10-year, $180 billion
I hope you heard it. It's $180 billion. Go on.
That's right. And, you know, just to, again, put that at scale, obviously a very different scale than the U.S., but level of funding-wise, very comparable to the Biden plan in the U.S. Within that plan, I'll give you a couple examples of really some advocacy wins on the part of cities and how we've been able to really ground this relationship with our federal government. Very recently, actually, and I'll start by saying it for a long time, and in many countries, it's assumed that public transit is the responsibility of the national government. That hasn't always been the case in Canada. It's been sort of left to regional governments, local governments going forward. But that we've shifted that quite dramatically, and the cities had a very active role, and communities really of all sizes from a transportation perspective, an active role in shifting that. And we're able to work with the federal government towards what has now been implemented, which is a permanent public transit fund, which is $3 billion annually from the federal government. And that's a permanent fund. So as the mayor can attest, having that kind of stability and the ability to plan long term is really quite game changing for cities and their ability to do that. And I would say, you know, we've really, through that, have widely moved the marker. All political parties in Canada recognize that at a national level, that public transit is something they need to invest in. And so we're seeing comparable commitments. You know, we're just through an election cycle, and public transit featured across the board. And so that's a very positive development. And that kind of a long-term commitment really enables cities then to do the kind of work that they need to do to affect modal shift in the way that needs to happen to meet our climate targets. The other example I'll give you, which is also exciting, and you referenced this, is around electrification. And particularly on transit electrification. So we're also have been able to work with the government the national government towards a commitment. It's a $2.7 billion commitment over 5 years to convert municipal transit over to electric. And so that's about a commitment that's worth about 5,000 diesel buses, which will be converted to electric vehicles. And for, again, sake of reference, that's about 40% of the fleet in Canada. So a significant investment again. And we're looking to now scale that beyond transit to municipal fleets, which are obviously, you know, big trucks and so forth, large emitters as well. But that's been a very positive development as well. And I'll credit, actually, it's a nice full circle moment we're having here. A colleague of mine was reminding me in a discussion about this conversation. It was actually at COP23 at a C40 conversation where we were really sort of energized by the idea of transit electrification and came back into the Canadian context and started to hammer that out with successive governments over time. And the last one is a new initiative, and we're still at the outset of really defining this with the government. But we're seeing now really the foundation for an intergovernmental coordination around accelerating and increasing urban density. And so the federal government has has a commitment out of this election to invest $4 billion in what is called a Housing Accelerator Fund. And that really is a fund that is intended to incent municipal level action. Around, you know, increasing density, zoning, transit-oriented development. Again, all things that are quite important to our ability at a city level to make progress and contribute towards our country's ability to meet our targets. And so that's very encouraging. We're still in the early days of working out with our national government what that will look like. But we're having a very strong conversation with them about what's possible within that fund, what are going to be the highest impact areas. And it's going to achieve, you know, there's a a housing affordability crisis in Canada. The fund is actually intended to increase the supply of affordable housing, which it will do, but it will have a strong climate lens on it, and cities are pushing for that because we want to be able to move in these specific spaces. So those are three, you know, there are many others, but three very specific examples, and I have to say, you know, that's been on the backs of a lot of advocacy by the mayors that have, you know, through a united voice across the country, through our organization, have been able to really push this through successive governments, and we've got in our current government a very willing partner to have this conversation.
Carol, I just want to say this is really encouraging story, you know, for multiple reasons. One, just not only the size of funds, but the stability of the funds.
Indeed, yeah.
You know, the fact that it's a predictable, because public infrastructure, especially public transport, is a multi-year investment. You know, it's not, you don't get it done in 1 year.
Yeah.
And the fact that there's stability to it, and the fact that because governments change every 4 years. We work with cities everywhere, government change every 4 years, but to have a stability there, it's very, very encouraging. And then progressively, for example, working on density.
Yeah.
Right? Or unaffordability of housing. So one thing is, I just want to say, yesterday, the Biden administration actually passed a bill that includes a lot of these things. Carol, I'm not sure who's learning from whom, so I'm not going to speculate. But it does include a very significant amount of resources for public transport, for grid infrastructure, and my favorite, it includes $2.5 billion for electric school buses for children. The United States has 480,000 school buses, and we at WRI actually are working to get all the school buses electrified, because I think our children don't deserve to breathe diesel buses. So I'm very, very happy to hear about your program. Ingrid, you've been thinking about this for a long time. You've been doing this for a long time. So at GIZ, which is one of the biggest organizations that's supporting, you know, providing technical support in the world, how are you supporting financing of NDC implementation in these countries that localizes action?
Yeah, well, I think perhaps on the general approach, what would you like to see, what should be financed, I would perhaps like to underline first that looking at the situation that cities are actually facing right now, I think we have to deal with three challenges. The first one is really to lower carbon in cities and prepare projects that would address this. But ideally, at the same time, you would do it in a way that you create more resilience and deal also with the adaptation to climate change that has to happen. And there are win-win opportunities, that's for clear. And you can actually seize them if you do proper planning. And planning really is a key core ingredient also then to invest in the right sectors, invest into the right programs. And finally, and this also is the story from Monterey, you have to do it in a way that you really address the human factor. It has to be human-centered. You have to deal with the vulnerability of people within the city, so that when you start to develop a project and try to reach out to financiers, that you can say, look, this is also the human impact. And we bring in those that have not a chance to be more inclusive part of cities' development. We deal with the vulnerability of people at the same time. So this triangular approach, so to say, is key for us. One of my favorite projects actually is the one that we are implementing together with the European Investment Bank. It's similar to what Kel has been approaching, bringing different actors together. And the key point is that actually the European Investment Bank is also a very powerful development bank, but they told us, look, normally it's so difficult and we have no source of funding to come to develop an investment plan, an investment project. So through the funding provided by the German Environment Ministry, this new actually initiative, which is called Felicity, man say Felicity, has been
award for acronym.
Exactly, has been created, and I would like to give you one example from Mexico. The Mexican city of Naucalpan, I hope Naucalpan, for example, has used this technical assistance to prepare a waste management project. And when it was actually, and it was done in a way that this project was fit for funding through the National Investment Program, the National Infrastructure Fund, which is called FONADIN. So that they got a matching fund, and FONADIN actually covered 30% of the investment cost. And then it was much easier actually to find the financing for the rest. So preparing a project in a way that it's fit for purpose for the available funding structure also can be very key. And therefore, I mean, this is one of the projects that I love very much because it actually brings together different actors, works with the investment bank, but also gives access to municipality to national funds that are available, but hasn't been, so to say, used so far. The second project is about transport, and this is a project that we are implementing in Indonesia, and it's about developing a climate-friendly transport infrastructure in Indonesia, but in a way that at the same time a huge amount of jobs are being created. And this is especially a project that has been asked for now after Indonesia is still in the midst of the pandemic, but the main purpose actually was really to deal with the employment issues at the city level. But at the same time, it was done in a way that you can also address the infrastructure, the transport problems that cities are facing. And the financing comes from the outside, it's from international donors, but at the same side, so that we can make sure that Indonesia can do its own part. At the same time, and this is done at the macro level, GIZ is advising the Indonesian government in how to develop a green finance system, how to mobilize actual resources that then can be put at the disposal for green infrastructure projects. So sometimes you also have, when you look into the financing and you want to mobilize more own resources at the national level, perhaps you also have to look into your own tax system, reduce subsidies that are not climate friendly, and perhaps mobilize through green bonds additional finance that would go also at the municipal level into climate-friendly infrastructure projects. So this is another example that I like very much because it addresses the macro issues that we have also to consider, to put also governments, national governments, in a position to mobilize more resources for climate protection.
Funding for a bigger pool of funding. I really like your example of creating jobs, which is across the world, because of the pandemic, that's in front and center of all levels of government, national governments, local governments, and every government is trying to find solutions that creates not only decarbonizing, but creates jobs. Luis, I wanted to come back to you. A lot of the time, I was just thinking of Carol's answer of a very positive relationship with cities and national government, but we often find that national governments in our research at WRI cities are actually often more ambitious in their climate policy, yes, climate plan than national governments are. And this is not unique to one country. It's actually across many countries. We have calculated. So when that happens, when Monterrey finds that you want to be more ambitious in a context where national governments are less ambitious, and our work has also shown, national policies are very critical for local action. Yes. If you take 100 things cities could do for better outcome,
federal policies often are very restrictive towards cities.
So what can cities do?
Well, we can bypass that. Looking towards help in the international community. We can create city alliances across the country and across the world. Those things also serve as a tipping point, creating pressure, political and social pressure upon the national authorities. And I don't want to say we force their hand, because that's not a way to bring someone to the table to cooperate. No. But you make it much more costly, politically speaking, that they refuse to help further this agenda. Because it's not my agenda, it's not the city's agenda, it's the planet's agenda, it's a race agenda. It's a very positive thing that we are here today, all these days, and we are talking about these things, and we have we realize what our NDCs are per nation, but you've all said it very well. If cities do not put in the work, I mean, even if the nation has the most ambitious program of it all, if cities do not put in the work, we will not meet them in time. And you also touched a very sensitive subject when you talked about the individual responsibility of each person. Because it's people that create emissions, not cities per se. It's the people that we live in, we live in the cities, we create those emissions. So we also need not only to create new public policy, both national and local, but we really need a huge paradigm shift in our people. And we really need to reevaluate what our priorities should be as a society. And some things may make us a bit uncomfortable, yeah, but that's part of evolution. I mean, growing up is difficult, but we need to grow up, or else we will stop growing forever.
I agree with you that individuals have a lot of responsibility, but our experience is that you do build cities that encourage you to do something. If you have a city that has public transport and walkability, you would not, and discourage car use, you can build cities that shape public behavior. So I just want to make sure we're not putting all the responsibility on individuals, but I think we can build environments.
It's in parallel.
That is parallel. I love what you said about alliance. Adi, I want to go to you because you have been, I know personally, have been trying to build alliances across city, public sector, private sector, both in Mexico and in Colombia, to move this, what Luis was saying, to move this issue around between cities and national government. This is something with the Coalition on Urban Transition. And Adi, what is your experience? What are the ingredients of success here? Because this is critical, right? Critical to get this alliance, as Luis says, together. What is the ingredient for success here?
I would say I would go to the thing of the common objective, right? If we have the common objective of going against climate and building a better and more equal society, which I would say this is a huge thing for Latin America in general. We are not so poor anymore, but we have huge inequalities. We have a lot of poor people, and unfortunately the numbers have grown immensely this past year. So how can we do things together? So first is the common vision. We really need a common objective. And by having the common objective is how do we create alignment in programs? We really have to come from ideas into programs that have a more stable way of participation. I think Carol really touched on something that's absolutely essential, that's creating things that are stable over time, because this gives the opportunity for cities to prepare. To be able to match finances, they need to prepare projects. When the fund is there, they start really to prepare the projects, to understand how to move forward. And this creates an implicit alliance. It's not only a words alliance, it's something that is really working on the day-to-day for the cities, for the federal government, and creating value for the citizens. And I think this is recognizable. You can see over time what's going on. Luis, now we have a huge thing in Monterrey to transform the city, because it's a city that has been oriented for cars for a long time, for example. And he needs all possible support from the federal government, from FONADIN, which is in Mexico the substantial way to get finance. It's the National Infrastructure Fund. So if cities cannot allow with clear pass to the National Infrastructure Fund, it's very hard to move forward. It's the big vehicle today for national funds. So if you want to, you have to create financial mechanisms that work in the most transparent way, so that you can help small cities, big cities, and really get to the target. So you also have to evaluate to see if afterwards we are going to the direction that we imagine we were going. And how can we work, what can we do as support partners, as technical partners, really help create this evaluation mechanism to understand how to move forward, to see what are the experiences, just like GIZ has been doing in Mexico for a long time, or ourselves, actually we are partners, and we join up together so that the new generation of municipalities can come with ideas and we can start really driving direction. So I think partnerships are absolutely vital, and growing the coalitions for joint action totally. And just two more very fast examples are, we created two coalitions that now are working very well. One for the authorities of mobility, right, and working with the Senate, the chamber, and then with the states, we could pass even a constitutional change to get mobility as a right. You know, so if we add forces, we can really do great things together.
And Audrey also did a fantastic thing to get, before elections, get the candidates, no matter which party they were, to commit to sustainable mobility. So no matter who got elected, they actually had a platform for sustainable mobility. Carol, I want to go back. I come from India. And India, so we're talking about nations and cities, right? In India, like in Mexico, like in Canada, there are states. They play in India's case, they played a very important role. So the partnership that Audrey is talking about requires not only relationship with nations and cities, it requires a relationship with nation states and cities. Mm-hmm. In Canada, provinces are a very important part of the political system. So all this has to work, right?
Yes.
How does it work in Canada?
Yes.
Or more specifically, what are the lessons to make it work?
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks. I was hoping you're going to ask me a question about intergovernmental coordination that would let me talk about. You know, we have shared a lot about the positive success story in Canada, but we certainly
let's get into it.
Let's get into it. We have a lot of work to do, both to continue to strengthen our relationship with the federal government, but also really with the provincial government as well. And it's critical. They are critical partners in so much of what cities need to deliver. You know, transit being a great example. Where provinces really need to help support operating at a municipal level as well, and so it goes beyond sort of the ability to build and capital. And so, I mean, any issue across the board, each order of government in the Canadian context, almost any issue, we have levers that come into play that need to be aligned, that need to be coordinated if we're going to maximize public dollars and move as quickly as the climate crisis demands of us. And so I think even in the Canadian context, it's complicated, and we have a lot of work to do to continue to do that. I would say we're sort of on a positive trajectory there in terms of our ability to start doing this. I'll give you some very specific examples in areas where we need to see strengthened collaboration at an intergovernmental level. The first is around buildings, and so really this is a case in one part of that equation on alignment, where we need to making sure that across the governments we're aligned on what those incentive programs are. Again, important to maximize the dollars and make them go as far as they can from the public system, and as well, you know, from an issue of equity as it relates to energy as well going forward, and affordability. And so there's really a need to align on those kinds of programs. A good problem to have when you have enough programs that becomes an issue, but one that's serious nonetheless. Similarly, you know, we need to accelerate the adoption of net zero building codes in Canada, and that is really one that is quite, in different parts of the country, looks quite different in terms of where the levers sit. And to your point, actually, that you were making to the mayor around where cities are ahead, you know, I was speaking with David Miller, who's a former mayor of Toronto and a colleague in C40, and it's both of our favorite example of where a city is really leading, and it's a Canadian example, which is Vancouver, which has one of the leading building codes really internationally, and we're really trying to have a conversation with provincial governments, with our federal government around how do we mobilize around this? How do we make sure that we've got the right enabling legislation so that cities can do this kind of work? But it's a critical part. It's one of the biggest contributors and biggest levers we have to meet our climate goals. And so a very tangible example of where we need to do better when we're working together. Transportation, another good example. Our government has made a very impressive, and our national government, very impressive and good commitment towards electrification of all passenger vehicles, very ambitious target. It means upgrading our electrical grids. It means charging infrastructure. It means a number of things that need to be both supported financially and mobilized, and some capacity building that needs to happen around that as well. So another area where we really need to work together across governments to do that, as it relates to climate, solid waste management. Another good example of this, and really reducing the methane emissions from municipal landfills. We, at a municipal level, fully support this and support the regulations that are going to move in that direction, but need to be a part of that conversation pretty intensely to make sure that it's happening in ways that are implementable at a local level in the kinds of timelines that we need to see. Anyways, there are a number of examples, and I would argue, obviously from a city perspective, that we need the more intergovernmental coordination, the better. Cities need to be at the table for these conversations, and that even in the Canadian context, we have work to do. Yeah.
Even in the Canadian context. What we are finding, actually, Adriana's team is doing a lot of work on air quality now, and which requires a multi-jurisdictional action, right? There's few of these problems you talked about actually requires planning and execution and analysis, multi-jurisdictional. But that's where an entity that is beyond city, like a province, can play a very, very important role, and they're critical to play a role. So I'm happy to see, look, every country has work to do. I think Canada is way ahead in that. Louise, Carol mentioned C40, and there are many city networks, and we have found over the last 10 years, actually, cities working with other cities been a powerful force. They've learned faster. Mayors learn much faster from other mayors. There's a little bit of competition among mayors, which is actually a very good thing. They learn from each other. So in your experience, Louise, and we have found that to be a powerful motivator, bringing people together. In Paris, for the first time, 400 mayors came together. That was a moment, and there hasn't been a COP since that cities were not included because of that, right? Louise, what is your experience working with other mayors? My specific question actually is about financing. Have you been able to use that power together to actually facilitate finance?
Well, it has been done in the past. I mean, I recently took office about a month ago, so my experience is pretty recent, but the level of coordination and collaboration that is being implemented between all the mayors of the metropolitan area is unprecedented. And that is not, the first of its kind. We have other examples across the country that former mayor alliances have done wonderful things for progress. Bless you. We have in Jalisco, the metropolitan area of Guadalajara, has done tremendous job furthering a climate agenda, a metropolitan agenda, infrastructure goals, financing. So that is a brilliant example of how things work much better if you use a collaborative approach. So that's why I'm here, actually. That's why I wanted to talk to you and get close to initiatives like C40, for example, so we can learn what other cities are doing and how to implement those best practices in our own metropolitan area. I mean, nobody's discovering anything new here. We are just a little late, but we want to, get ahead of the curve.
Talking about not discovering new, Ingrid, I want to go to next. So Ingrid not only is heading GIZ now, she has many years of experience at the World Bank, heading the German Development Agency, BMZ. Ingrid, one of my questions is, we are all talking about how important cities are for climate. We are all convinced about it. And we have shown by evidence how important it is that you can't actually get to 1.5 degrees without cities working, right? The sciences couldn't be clearer. Yet, actually very few NDCs explicitly talk about a city's agenda today. Very few. They talk about transport, they talk about energy, but cities are not just transport energy. It's a political entity with a lot of powers to change. A lot of innovation in the world of governance comes from cities. Why? What do you think we need to do so in the future, this conversation we're having about nation states, which is very important, that we actually bring the power of cities, that is to bring, in the climate, because as we know, cities have been acting on climate, Vancouver, you said, as the most actually one of the best resilience plans in the world. What do you think, be reflective here, Ingrid, what do you think needs to happen? You have worked very closely with NDC Partnership, you work with governments who are putting together NDCs. What needs to happen, you think?
But I think that, of course, when you look into the first round of NDC elaboration, of course, you see that there was little capacity in many countries to elaborate really sophisticated NDCs, not only covering specific sectors and establishing sector targets, nor looking into specific, perhaps, stakeholder areas like municipalities. So I think there is now a growing evidence, as you have said, how important it is to work with cities and actually to put cities in a position to contribute to the climate agenda and make them more resilient against the impact of climate change. But of course, you have then to really invest into the analytical basis and the capacity also at the cities level so that they can really play their part. If the analysis is lacking, what does it mean if extreme weather events hits my city? What are the tools that I could apply? How should I deal with those challenges? What are they going to express when they ask governments that they need help? Or when they approach international investment banks and say, look, could you imagine to invest in infrastructure that will put me in a position to be more resilient against floods or droughts? So I think it's now in recognizing the evidence that is now at hand, how important investment in city is, I think the next steps when NDCs are going to be put more into practice, which means investment plans, specific project pipelines, technical assistance, capacity building, research capacity that should be built up also at country level. I think then cities could become a player at the forefront and would perhaps be brought into the NDC implementation much more forcefully than in the past. Some countries have done so already. And what the NDC partnership, of course, could do when they sit together at country level and start to discuss with donors investment plans to bring cities to the table, have a specific consultation rounds with cities, their mayors, and local communities, and make sure that this is not being forgotten. I think, because what I see, I mean, the window of opportunity is huge. I sincerely hope that all the commitments made on climate finance, that they're going to be fulfilled very soon, and that we see a constant increase in public international financial support to the climate agenda. And therefore, I think now is the moment to invest in cities' capacity to be a very, so to say, informed interlocutor in this discussion, because then the cities can seize the opportunity to get the funding that they need. And international donors perhaps should consider themselves much more as a bridge, not to bypass national governments, but to convince national governments that investing in cities through the right instruments is worthwhile doing.
And that's what I'm asking you, Ingrid, because it seems to me every country needs to have more ambitious climate plans, right? We have seen ambition. We most probably won't get to 1.5, but the next generation ambition is needed from national government. At the same time, there are cities in their countries, they have very ambitious actions they are planning. So it seems logical to me to have a framing device, that's just the way you said, that includes cities so that the climate finance, then when they've agreed to it, actually flows to cities. I mean, it would seem to me a logical next step, which is not happening actually in very few countries. Very few countries actually have cities there.
Only a handful, yeah.
Luis, you had something to say.
Well, yeah, I see that there are some countries that are already doing it, but shouldn't the discussion worldwide should begin with local NDCs? I mean, I know NDCs are a national commitment.
You're absolutely right. That's why Ingrid is a kind of an expert in this topic. And you're absolutely right. Shouldn't we start with that? But the framing device of ENFCCC, where we're sitting here, is actually national governments.
Yes, but
that requires a little change, Luis, I think. I mean, Ingrid, you can change my mind on this, that how we frame the question.
Well, I think it requires like an additional layer. For instance, you speak about transport. Depending on what kind of country it is, you may say, okay, I have a sector target for transport of reduction in CO2 emissions, blah, blah, blah. So then the question is, how do you actually put this into practice? Could be through big scale investments that are being needed, etc. But it could also be done by saying, look, I mean, if I look what cities could contribute, I mean, those bigger growing metropolitan areas, when I want to achieve these targets, it means that one has to connect the more national transport goals with the specific action in cities, bring in those stakeholders and discuss those targets. But this is, for many countries, is a different type of doing, of working together, even within a government. Not in all countries you have actually formats or platforms for dialogue with other stakeholders.
We'll start with Canada, I think.
Yeah, I mean, Canada is a bit, I mean, in some countries this is already in the case, but in many developing countries, they are struggling really to bring other government levels into the play. Peru is a good example where, but for many, many years, a couple of agencies were actually supporting the Peruvian government to bring the states and the local governments into the consultation process of the NDC, which meant that actually they formulated an NDC, but then they went through all the different levels and to make sure that they contribute as well as the private sector.
And also to make sure the national government can deliver. That's a very good practice, right?
This is really, I think, a role model for many countries.
Absolutely.
But it took some time and a lot of resources as well. And of course, political leadership.
And that's where NDC Partnership can help. Luis, did you want to add something? Or?
Well, I think Ingrid just pointed out very, very, very well. If we don't start shifting the discussion towards nations assuming that the leadership doesn't start and end with them, that they have to incorporate cities and state governments into the table for integrated construction of the NDC model. It begins with the responsibilities that the city must assume and the compromise that the federal government and the state government have to make for the city for its implementation. It's not going to work, or it's going to work. It's going to take more time.
It's going to become better.
Yes.
The way you just said. You know, I'm going to shift gear. We are about a few minutes left to the end. Today is Nature Day here at COP. I'm going to ask each one of you what cities can do for nature. So think about it for a minute. Before I do that, I want to take all of you back to the video you saw when we started. Because what the pandemic that has taken place for the last year and a half, 2 years, it's been devastating for cities, not just because of disease, because poor people in cities actually have been impacted the most. And our work in WRI, we just published a piece of work called Towards a More Equal Cities that showed that you can't get to a climate positive city without actually tackling inequality.
Yes.
So while you think of nature, I want to ask Audrey. Audrey actually has done a fantastic amount of work about how a city can think of inequality in their planning process. In Mexico City, you've done that for your planning. Share with our audience how this important dimension can be brought into the climate planning process.
Well, we really see this as a joint challenge. When we look, we have prepared the Index of Inequality of Cities, which really looks at access. You know, how long does it take for a person from the richest and the poorest part of Mexico to get to a job? And there is a big difference. You know, in Mexico City, it could be 5 times difference from a poor area to a rich area. But for a university, it could be 100 times more access depending on where you live. So we really need to look at infrastructure in a way that we give more access. It's where we build houses, what's the density, how do we build the transportation systems, what are the kind of things that we are putting everywhere, where are the schools, where is every equipment in the city. So long work to do, but a lot of information on the table to be able to do it.
And Ingrid and I have another session, I think, a few days, talking about inequality in cities. Please join us there. So each one of you, quick thought about today, because it's a special day here of Nature Day, what could cities do for nature? Carol, you first.
Yeah, it's a great question. There's nature-based solutions have got to be a part of the equation. And that includes everything from tree planting, from canopy preservation, natural asset management. All of those things are critical elements to ensuring that we can do this. And I'd be remiss to say, I know we're focused here on cities and large cities, and we're talking about scale, but I'll give you in the Canadian context as well, nature-based solutions are a really tangible thing that communities, the mid-sized, small-sized rural communities have a particular capacity to work at as well. And so I think really right across the board from a local government perspective, it's got to be a critical element.
Thank you. Louise.
Well, I was going to talk about my climate action plan and our green project portfolio, but I'm going to say something that's going to sound at first a little bit far-fetched, but bear with me for a second. I think the best thing that a city could do for nature is education. Education is really the base of everything, because you form the future upon the education that you give to your citizens. And that responsibility, well handled, will give not only national responsible citizens, but global citizens that will face the facts and implement nature-based solutions in a much more efficient and proficient way.
Thank you, Louise. Fundamental point. Ingrid.
Well, I was thinking about if we continue to construct cities as we do it right now, our CO2 budget will be exploited in the very near future. So we have to reinvent how cities can grow. So we need new building materials. We have to create circular economies so that actually the footprint of cities vis-a-vis the rest of nature and the economy can be minimized. I mean, the only solution to protect the climate is really to use resources a couple of times. The circular economy concept, I think, is absolutely key. And urban areas actually provide such a good opportunity to prove that this is doable. Reinvent the way we're doing construction, using wood instead of concrete, building constructions, and so forth. Because if you continue to use all these very scarce materials, we use nature. And we see this when we go out to developing countries.
Absolutely. Audrey.
Well, we eat, we breathe, and we drink water. And none of this can be solved in the city. We really need to be conscious of we are part of a bigger system and use even our political individual power to be able to ask for better solutions in nature so that we can be well in cities.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you for this fantastic panel. You heard it here. My name is Ndc Partnership. I'm the CEO of WRI. And you heard how national government and cities can work together for a better world and for 1.5 degrees. Thank you for joining us.